This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Popular Music Books in Process series, a joint project of IASPM US, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the Pop Conference. I'm Carl Wilson, one of the series organizers, along with Francesca Royster, Gus Stadler, Antonia Rudolph, Kimberly Mack, and on leave this year, Eric Weisbart. You can find our whole calendar on the IASPM website under the Journal tab, and you can also catch up on videos of all of our past sessions on Eric's YouTube channel, including last week's on the upcoming Taylor Swift academic anthology. Next Monday, I will be in conversation with Robert Dayton about his new book on Canadian glam, so please don't miss that. But today we're very pleased to have John Shaw in conversation with Francesca Royster on John's work in progress, Trickster Virtuoso, Louis Armstrong, St. Louis Blues, and African American Modernism. I'll give you some quick background about our presenters. John Shaw is an elementary classroom teacher for Seattle Public Schools and an active union member. He was a founding member of Chicago's experimental and non-hierarchical theater Oobleck, has self-released several albums of original songs and music, has scored several stage plays and an experimental film that has been exhibited internationally, and is the author of the excellent This Land That I Love, Irving Berlin, Woody Guthrie, and the Story of Two American Anthems, which was published by Public Affairs Books in 2013. And Francesca Royster is professor of English at DePaul University in Chicago, and the topics of her scholarly work have ranged from Shakespeare, Prince, and Black lesbian country music fans to Fela Kuti on Broadway. Her books include Black Country Music, Listening for Revolutions, the winner of the 2023 Ralph Gleason Popular Music Book Prize, Choosing Family, a memoir of queer motherhood and Black resistance, Sounding Like a No-No, Queer Sounds and Eccentric Acts in the Post-Soul Era, and Becoming Cleopatra, the Shifting Image of an Icon. During their conversation, please post your questions as you think of them in the chat. And in the last part of the session, Kim will call on you to unmute and ask them during the Q&A. And of course, we also encourage you to use the chat for comments and conversation. However, we ask the presenters to ignore the chat during the discussion. We'll send them a copy of the chat transcript later so they can catch up on everything. But yeah, don't expect responses during the session from the chat. And now I'm happy to turn things over to John and Francesca.
Thanks, Carl.
Thanks, Carl. This is great. John, I have so enjoyed immersing myself in St. Louis Blues and just thinking through your eyes and thinking about the lenses that you provide about Louis Armstrong, who's definitely been a family favorite. A branch of my family is from New Orleans, and when they moved to Chicago, Louis Armstrong was kind of the touch point back home again. And I also am really so glad to be in conversation with you because I know that you have missed a day with your students to be here. So that really means a lot. And it's really great to be in conversation with you about these topics. So maybe just to get us started, you could just walk us through your book and like how you kind of came to this project and this particular approach of Afro-modernism.
Thanks, Francesca. I'm thrilled that you agreed to talk with me today and to work with me leading up to this. I loved your book, Black Country Music, so much, so it's an honor to be talking with you. You asked me this question when we had a preparatory conversation on Friday, and I realized I skipped a piece. I still am in conversation with the agent who sold my Woody Guthrie and Irving Berlin book, and he pitched to me some years ago, 5, 6 years ago, how about a song on an alternative American anthem? And the first thing I thought of was St. Louis Blues, particularly the version that I focus on, or that is sort of the linchpin of the project, and that is Louis Armstrong's collaboration with the New York Philharmonic and conducted by Leonard Bernstein in 1956. An 8.5 minute, if I remember right, 8.5 minute arrangement that combines sort of Hollywood classical and Armstrong's working sextet at the time. An excellent, excellent band. it's a super interesting performance in itself, but what really just knocked me over when I first time I heard it were the speeches afterwards. Bernstein, very courtly, very flattering, and condescending. He refers in the middle of this list of compliments, he slips in this adjective simple to describe Armstrong's music. And my hackles, they are raised. That just is so off, so wrong in so many ways. And then Armstrong answers, very flattering, and says, I probably won't quote it 100% accurately, but something to the effect of, "Thank you, Mr. Bernstein. This is our first time playing with the symphony orchestra. And as we cats say, it gassed me, man, it gassed me." And then he switches, and because the song's composer, W.C. Handy, was in the audience, 83 years old, Armstrong had recorded an album of all Handy songs 2 years before. Handy had been in the studio with Armstrong at the time. Armstrong had recorded Handy's songs in St. Louis Blues for over 30 years at that point. So he says that to Bernstein, "It gassed me, man, it gassed me. And we'd like to thank Mr. Handy for being our guest tonight, because I've been playing his music for a long, long time. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen." And that's it. And that rhetorical shift it wowed me. It wows me. It's so brilliant. It's so undermining of Bernstein's hierarchy. And it was so charming and flattering that I don't think Bernstein noticed. There's no indication that Bernstein noticed. Not only does the rhetorical shift undermine Bernstein, but it also plays off of African American, or stereotypes of African American performance that Armstrong played with on and off his whole career, and he received quite a bit of criticism for it, of playing the happy, jive-talking hipster for white audiences. My take on his career, though, and I haven't heard everything he's done. I don't know that anybody has everything nobody has, obviously, but I haven't heard all the recordings that are available. But my take on it is that he was almost always using those images, that imagery, that form of presentation in a way to subvert white dominated hierarchies, and to promote African American dignity subterraneously. St. Louis Blues is incredibly rich by the time they play it in 1956. There have been Charles Hamm, in his book Yesterday's American Popular Music, book came out in 1980 or something. He has an appendix which lists the most recorded songs up to between 1900 and 1950. And according to him, and I don't know what his source is because he doesn't put a footnote for this, St. Louis Blues was the most recorded song of any songs anywhere as of 1950. And it's the list of musicians who have recorded it is just eye-popping. Armstrong many times, Bessie Smith twice, Art Tatum at least twice, Earl Hines many times. Just Dizzy Gillespie had recorded it just once at that point, but he went on to record it more times. Just so many of the most amazing musicians in jazz, and some of the greatest blues musicians, and some great country musicians had recorded it, and classical musicians, and Hawaiian musicians, and Cuban musicians, and European musicians. So many just amazing versions in styles ranging across a huge gamut. So it's a site of African American beauty, joy, and excellence, and it's a song that is available to any musician to play and bring their best self to. As with so much of our culture, though, this song became appropriated by blackface minstrelsy musicians who used it to promote degrading imagery. Emmett Miller's probably the most famous of the white blackface musicians to have recorded it. He's not, I mean, he's famous in music scholarly circles. He's not particularly famous outside of that realm. As I was digging into the project, and I don't think I knew this at the time yet, Bob Wills covered it as well. And I'd been a Bob Wills fan since college, and a friend of mine sent me a Bob Wills cassette of his radio transcriptions where he covered "Take the A Train" and other jazz songs and a bunch of country songs as well, and blues songs. And they're just really this fantastic Western swing band. But his first recording session, he recorded St. Louis Blues, and he imitated Emmett Miller, and it sounds awful. Anyway, I think that's enough. I've been talking long enough for one answer.
That's terrific. I mean, I really appreciate the richness of the project because you are both exploring the history of the song as it's kind of been taken up by all these different artists, and really kind of showing the fabric of jazz and blues and American music and how it's shaped this larger picture, which I think is really exciting. And then also kind of interrogating Louis Armstrong's image, his artistry, his performances as examples of Black excellence too. So, I really I find both of those topics really fascinating, and you have shared some of where those points intertwine. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the trickster aspect of Armstrong, and why it's important to this history of the song. And I just was thinking about a recent documentary that I watched, Louis Armstrong, Black and Blue, where it does explore kind of these sometimes conflictual images of Armstrong as the musician's musician, or as like the consummate performer, or the performer who, for like Black nationalist activists like Ozzie Davis, he's sort of the sign of what's wrong in terms of the earlier generation of artists who play to stereotypes about Black masculinity. So yeah, if you can tell us more about the Trickster Virtuoso element a little bit more.
That's a provisional title. I'm not entirely happy with it, but I think it works because he definitely did played the role of a trickster in many instances, many more than I know of, I'm sure. But the key one for the book is when he just flips the script on Bernstein and puts the New York Philharmonic into the role of pop fun. It gassed me. That's great. And then when he's addressing someone whom he truly respects, he doesn't put on any jive talk. He just says, "Thank you, Mr. Handy. Thank you for being here." So that's just a great trickster moment. There are anecdotes throughout his career. When he was playing for King George, playing in England, and King George VI was in the audience in the 1930s, he dedicated a song saying, "This one's for you, Rex," and he played "I'll Be Glad When You're Dead, You Rascal You," a song where a man is telling a rival who's stolen his woman that "I'll be glad when you're dead." He dedicated the same song to the Memphis police, I think also in the 1930s, when they were playing in Memphis and there were police officers in providing security in the concert hall. And one of the players in his band said, I'm not sure. I wasn't sure if we were going to get out of there alive, but there was no problem. He met Pope Paul VI in Rome, and Pope Paul VI extended his hand for Louis to kiss the ring, and Louis slapped his hand from below to give him 5. Pretty bold and, in my view, heroic stuff, and hilarious stuff.
That's great. And like thinking about those strategies, thinking about the ways, to me, it kind of speaks to like the kind of old-fashioned like mask, or the idea like Paul Laurence Dunbar's idea of mass performance, or even thinking about, fugitivity, thinking about the ways that in the history of Black performance, we have these figures who are able to use the performance of a particular self as a way to create a space of freedom, kind of beneath the scenes. And I'm also thinking about Daphne Brooks's work on Afro alienation, and just all of these different strategies that are kind of part of especially kind of modern and postmodern Black performance. So I know that you've thought a lot about modernity, and how Armstrong in this song are also informed by the movement of modernism, but in particular Afro-modernism. So it's been a while since my grad school days when I really studied and pinned down modernism. But do you want to tell us a little bit about that, and kind of what you're distinguishing between kind of modernism as a movement and Afro-modernism, and how it relates back to Armstrong?
Well, that's what that's what I'm still working on. It's complex, and it's just complex stuff, and but it's so rich. I'm so glad you mentioned Dunbar. That the poem is so amazing. We wear the mask, and I write about Dunbar. I don't think in the chapters I sent to you, I write about his strategy of using the mask similar to Armstrong's, and use the dialect descended from blackface minstrelsy to write most of his most popular poems, but always with an eye to, again, elevating African American dignity and promoting images of African American dignity beneath the mask or behind the mask. And it's a complex strategy. Masks are talked about by Yeats and Ezra Pound as well. As early book of Ezra Pound's was person. I don't know how to pronounce it. Personae. Masks. The Greek word for mask is persona, and it goes back to Greek tragedy and Greek comedy. So the Yeats and Pound were very, very much interested in masks, as was Browning before them, or dramatic monologues, and adopting different personae through which to present a poem. When looking at the work, though, and to me, Dunbar's use of these strategies, and also James Weldon Johnson's and Burt Williams's, and later Armstrong's, is just so much. It's so much richer than Yeats's or Pound's, because of the humanistic goals of equality and liberation to which Dunbar, Johnson, Williams, Armstrong, and many others were working. And a piece that I don't think we talked about on Friday, and it's not in the draft that I sent you, and something that's left out of the draft so far. I think European modernism and Eurocentric modernism, American modernism that was allied mostly with European modernism, white American modernism, I think it really became much more pessimistic after the First World War. The First World War happened, and the modernists thought, what the heck? What are we doing? How can we believe these stories we've told ourselves about ourselves as a culture, as a people, that about the Enlightenment, about humanism, after what we've done to each other on the battlefields of Europe. And there's a real solipsism to that change, because that violence that the Dadaists were decrying, and that Henry James was lamenting, and T.S. Eliot was despairing over, that violence had been carried out by Europeans against the rest of the world for centuries at that point. But still, the narrative fell apart, and Eliot in his poem "The Wasteland," the climactic last line, it's a super memorable, great line: "These fragments I have shored against my ruins." So the narrative's fallen apart. Isolation, pessimism, despair feels so central to so much of Eurocentric modernism, particularly after the First World War. African American modernism, the narrative remained continuous because the goal remained liberation and equality. And the First World War, while catastrophic to any of the participants, and there definitely were African American soldiers and presumably Afro-French soldiers involved, and soldiers of African descent working with other allied nations, and the war took place in the Middle East and North Africa as well. That didn't entail a collapse of a unifying cultural project or narrative. But I'm still working it out, and I'm eager for feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really I know that in your table of contents you also talk about the way that gender kind of is also informed by as you're following the trail of St. Louis blues. We didn't get a chance to talk about it before, so this will be kind of a fresh thing. But as you're thinking about the kind of differences, and especially kind of thinking about the precarity of Black life, that informs a different kind of idea about modernism and a different investment in the future. Maybe you can tell us about some of the gendered ways that you're seeing the book kind of moving.
Well, Angela Y. Davis's book. Now I'm blanking on the name. I'm sorry about that.
Blues Legacies or something like that. Is it Blues Legacies or Blues?
And Black Feminism.
Yeah, I have it somewhere, but I
have it upstairs. I can pull it off the shelf. It's an amazing book, focusing on Bessie Smith, Gertrude Rainey, and Billie Holiday. And she starts with the fact that most of the blues stars in the 1920s were women. And most of the blues songs that were published, and there, however many were not published that we don't know about, but most of the ones that were published were from a woman's point of view. And so the early blues in particular, but not just the early blues, is in Davis's account, and it's persuasive to me. The blues are central to, or a central or a great doorway into looking at the history of Black feminism. And St. Louis Blues was the first published blues song sung from a woman's point of view, as it turns out. And the early recordings, particularly by Bessie Smith, are just so powerful. And yes, it's a song of sorrow. Her man has left her, that no good man. Another woman stole him, and I'll always love him. But she has her dignity. She stands up, and she's going to be okay. And that's a real human story. It applies to people of all genders, or most people of all genders have been through some version of that, or of love lost or love unrequited. There's an element, as with the blackface backlash, there's a patriarchal backlash that plays out through the history of St. St. Louis Blues as well. Bessie Smith's only film appearance is in a 15-minute film from 1929 titled St. Louis Blues. And half of the film is, the second half of the film is an amazing performance by Smith, accompanied by the Hall Johnson Choir, which was a classical choir, African American choir, and a really hot jazz band led by the great James P. Johnson on piano. And it's a really great arrangement written by Rosamund Johnson, James Walton Johnson's composer brother, and it may be I think W.C. Handy may have had a hand in the arrangement as well. So the music is absolutely fantastic, and the story is not about Bessie's strength. And the character of the film is named Bessie. And again, Angela Davis writes about this, and so I'm not presenting anything new here. I'm just standing on her shoulders. I hope she doesn't mind. The film really portrays the female protagonist of the song in a really degrading way. Her man not only leaves her, but is physically abusive, steals money from her, taunts her, and it's really depressing. So that's definitely a part of the history of the song. Unfortunately, that recording, it was early in the sound film history. It was 1929, so the sound quality is not that great, but it's a fantastic performance. And the music's never been commercially released in the United States. I think I bought it on CD on a French import that I found in a $2 bin of a CD store, and I'm so glad I have it. But you can see the whole film on YouTube, and the dancing's fantastic. Bessie Smith's performance is fantastic. The music arrangement is fantastic, and the story is depressing. I forgot the name of the actor who portrays the rakish lover, but he's a terrific dancer. And there's way more to just that film that is not part of the patriarchal backlash or the sexist backlash, which maybe we'll talk about in a little bit. One of my favorite recordings is from 1954, Louis Armstrong with his sextet, the album he made with Louis Armstrong sings W.C. Handy. And it's the opening track, St. Louis Blues, and it's just rocking. And it's sung mostly by his singer, Velma Middleton, is the singer of his band. Really solid, powerful, humorous blues singer. And then they interpolate, after singing the printed lyrics, they interpolate a lot of floating lyrics, or maybe lyrics of their own invention, perhaps, which St. Louis Blues has tons and tons and tons of lyrics that have been added to it by many different performers, and many of them are great. But one of them, Velma Middleton, is boasting of why the men like her, and then Louis sings too, and threatens to beat her with a fence picket, and he's laughing as he says it, and she laughs him off. Now, don't go berserk on me. But it feels like part of the patriarchal backlash as well, even in a joking manner, and it's super ambiguous, and it's really uncomfortable, and it leads into just one of the hottest trombone solos by Trummy Young I've ever heard. He's just as if he's enacting the violence of Armstrong's threat, or maybe protesting the violence of the threat. It's really ambiguous. It's an incredible recording. It's 1954, and at the end, the pianist Billy Kyle is playing the triplets, the rock and roll fourth high up on the piano register, where in the key of E it would be E and B, da, 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 which is on sort of cliched associated with Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis, or Danny and the Juniors. It's there in 1954 on this recording of St. Louis Blues by Louis Armstrong. And then the band is just raging. So female power and male objection to female power, it runs through the history of the song as well. It doesn't really come into play in the encounter between Bernstein and Armstrong, except that Armstrong had a role in some of those interchanges before 1956.
That's just really fascinating. And yeah, kind of thinking about the role of women in popular music and commercial music and the ways that, in like early blues, how important women as audience members, as well as the subjects of the stories themselves and the songs were so important. And then the kind of shift of sorts that, I mean, do you think it kind of also parallels the movement or maybe transformation of blues as a genre to other genres like rock? Or what do you think is happening generically as you're tracing St. Louis blues?
Everything's happening. Everything's happening all at once, and the song keeps pace with everything that's happening there. Dizzy Gillespie plays at bebop. The great Cuban-born band leader Machito, and I've forgotten his real name. I could look it up. He does a blazing Q-bop version before Gillespie's. There are country versions from the 30s and 40s aside from the Bob Wills one I mentioned. Bob Wills recorded it many times. And after he recorded it twice in the 1930s in this whining style derived from Emmett Miller. But after that, he dropped the whining and he just loved the song, and he performed the song. And they're not awful after 1937. And then it happens a little bit later, but after in 1958, there's the W.C. Handy biopic starring Nat King Cole with Pearl Bailey, Eartha Kitt, and Ella Fitzgerald all in it. After the 1958 movie came out, all of them released versions of it, and there was sort of an explosion. Isley Brothers did a hot R&B version. Laverne Baker did a hot R&B version with backup singers, sort of doo-woppy, both of those versions. Brenda Lee had a sort of version, sort of doo-woppy version, also very hot, apparently inspired by Laverne Baker's. Chuck Berry did it in his style in 1965. It's fantastic. So the song is really adaptable, obviously. And there were a host of modern jazz versions in the 60s and later 50s after the film came out. But there had been another huge part of the story that I haven't mentioned yet, though, is by the 1930s, the boogie woogie pianists are taking it up. Albert Ammons, I think, might have been the first, but the Albert Ammons, Pete Johnson, Meade Lux Lewis all recorded it in boogie woogie fashion. Also in duets. There's also a version with all three of them playing it together that's just pounding. It's really great. Earl Hines had a pretty big hit, one of his biggest hits with a song called Boogie Woogie on the St. Louis Blues, just St. Louis Blues under a different title, but with the Boogie Woogie figures. Art Tatum recorded a Boogie Woogie version in 1940 after having recorded it in his typical just crazy virtuoso style in 1933, I think in his first recording session. So the Boogie Woogie thread for me is so central because the bass figures of Boogie Woogie, I think, are understood. They're not understood well enough how central they are to all is probably an overstatement, but to most genres since 1928 and the first Boogie Woogie recording with that title, Pine Top's Boogie Woogie. I think it's 1928. Country boogies, however many of them, Boogie Woogie and jazz, and then Boogie Woogie comes into some people describe Professor Long hairstyle as rumba boogie, and so central to New Orleans R&B and New Orleans style after 1950. And that is just the syncopated bass riff of Boogie Woogie is fundamental to soul and funk and heavy metal and punk and however many genres around the world. It's just huge. And I don't think its hugeness is really well understood at all. And St. Louis Blues isn't key to that, I don't think, but it's part of the story. St. Louis Blues, there's many Boogie Woogie versions of St. Louis Blues. including by one of my personal faves, Hadda Brooks, the queen of the boogie, who is not well represented in a lot of histories and anthologies of boogie woogie. She's fantastic. This is this is in the last chapter, and we haven't had a chance to talk about it, but the first recorded blues song was also by W.C. Handy, 1914, Memphis Blues. And Handy didn't write the lyrics, and he might not have even been aware of the lyrics. And he had sold the song because he was disappointed that it hadn't done well, sold it to another publisher. The next publisher hired a lyricist. He'd written it in 1912. The lyricist wrote a story about going to Memphis and hearing a band by this man named Handy, and this song called the Memphis Blues, this wonderful song that when you hear it, it strikes your heart like a Southern sorrow song. It's like an advertisement for Handy's ambitions as a composer. He wrote about wanting to combine the syncopation of ragtime with the melodic grace and beauty of the spirituals, which W.B. Du Bois called the sorrow songs. So I think it's a white lyricist using Du Bois's vocabulary to put in a lyric to a song by W.C. Handy where he talks about this mythic bandleader named W.C. Handy in 1914. It's just kind of surreal that the first blues song talks about W.C. Handy as a mythic figure. It's kind of amazing. So this first recorded blues song by W.C. Handy talks about the sorrow songs, which are then however many decades or centuries old. It goes back well into the 19th century, maybe in the 18th century. I don't know that history well enough. The first recorded blues song. And then 60 some years later, the first hip hop hit by Sugar Hill Gang, Rapper's Delight. The first verse, the first stanza, I said a hip hop. Already hip hop is in the past. I said a hip hop. Those are the very first words of the very first hip hop hit. And then the third line is up jump the boogie to the rhythm of the boogie, the beat. And so hip hop announces itself as bringing the past with it, bringing the boogie with it that is decades old, and the boogie brought with it the sorrow songs from the past, and this enormous continuity of 150 years, bam, right in two songs. It really speaks to me. It really speaks to the continuity and the continuity and the solidarity of African American modernism. We will bring the past with us in our efforts to create a just and free present and future.
That's terrific. I really I know we were talking a lot about, or kind of debating whether the seeds of Afrofuturism are in this music, and I think that you're really showing us that they are, especially in the ways that Afrofuturist impulses have that kind of Sankofa aspect of looking backwards in order to move forwards, or in order to create a future with like Black life and imagination and creativity, a future sustained by those things. And I also really appreciate your just your characterization of blues, because sometimes it feels like this history is treated, as a kind of museum piece, and can feel very static in terms of how the blues is kind of presented and within a kind of narrative of of American music making. And so to really kind of think about the continuities through this song, I think is quite interesting. So let's see. Oh, one thing I also really love about your writing that you shared was just your willingness to put yourself into the story, or just to kind of think about the ethics of your own investment in these histories. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that, about just wrestling with some of your own role as a music writer and how you're thinking about that as you're writing.
Well, it's I'm writing about a story of I'm writing a story of mostly African American music, but the intersection between, or the interactions between, African American music and white culture. And it's not African American, although, you know, I grew up surrounded by African American music, as pretty much all Americans do. It's not fundamentally my music. So I just I just want to be upfront about that, and look for the work of African Americans to lead the way in my thinking as much as I'm able to. That said, so I'm just trying to do my best with that and trying to be honest and open about it. The song really is I came across, after we spoke on Friday, I came across some notes that I'd written down and forgotten about. At one point, one of a working title was Pop Crucible for the song, the history of the song. And the song is when Cab Calloway comes to his first recording session and records St. Louis Blues at his first recording session, and it is outrageously virtuoso and just outrageous in a way. It's like he's bringing it to this song, and he's declaring his identity as a musician through this song. And Art Tatum did the same thing, and so many other musicians, not necessarily at the first recording session, so many other musicians seem to treat the song as, this is where I'm going to make a statement. Not every musician, not every version has that feeling to me, but many of them do. What's fascinating about the song is that in the publication, the 1914 publication, the central melody is in a tango rhythm. So Handy is saying in 1914, American identity is multicultural. It's ragtime and tango. And at that time, when he wrote it, blues was not a recognizable genre. It was musical, it was, according to the testimony of many musicians, mostly African American musicians, but also some white musicians, blues was a widespread practice throughout the South for decades before the 19 teens, when Handy started publishing his first blues. But I love that sort of, in a way, I think he was selling it as a gimmick, a catchy gimmick. Let's shift the rhythm. Dancers might like that. And he was right. But it also declares this is multicultural. And so identity is sort of built into the song, or questions of identity are built into the song. And since they're built into the song, I just want to be upfront about my own identity.
Sure. And I really appreciate that. And just like thinking about that intertwining of tango and blues, it just strikes me that so many changes and variations that we hear in music, and maybe Kim can also speak to this too, but like thinking about the ways that the situation of live performance and dancing kind of changed instrumentation, changed the ways that that musicians were also kind of using speed and all kinds of different things. So just thinking about the different occasions of recorded music versus live music, and how we get an even more opened up variety of sound in blues because of the situation of dance and entertainment and movement, is really very, very cool. Let's see. Well, I know that probably lots of folks have questions and comments, but I did want to just like throw out one last question? I loved our line of conversation when we were chatting the other day, because we were trying to think about like who is a contemporary figure like Armstrong, who is kind of a trickster virtuoso. Like is that kind of tricksterdom even necessary now in terms of the musical sphere? Do we have to think about like the beef between, well, I won't even go into that, never mind. But yeah, is there a figure though that you think of as kind of having a similar kind of investment in a kind of futurism in terms of the way that they convey their own role in terms of music?
Well, virtuosity, Black virtuosity is everywhere in music and continues to be. Um, I the first name that comes to mind is, and he's old fashioned now too, is Stevie Wonder. Not as much overtly a trickster, but he definitely uses humor, particularly to address his being a blind person. In live performance, he makes joking reference to. I've seen it on TV. One time I saw him live. He made joking reference to being blind, and it's funny. He's very funny, but also, and the one time I saw him, he was surrounded by keyboards, different keyboards, and an instrument that I don't even know the name of that he played at one point. It was a stringed instrument, like a sort of lyre or lyre that he played. And whenever he had to move from keyboard to keyboard, someone would accompany him, except once, and the whole band stopped. And it was a huge band with 7 backup singers, string section, horn section, 3 keyboardists, however many percussionists. I wrote it down at one point. But at one point, the whole band stopped, and he walked across the stage to an upright piano, and he walked really slowly. He knew where it would be because it had been worked out beforehand, but he enacted what his world was like in a way that was unspoken. He didn't mention it. He didn't talk about it. But he enacted what his world was like by moving so slowly across the stage to be careful. And that was just so powerful. It was so powerful after he'd made jokes about driving earlier in the concert. So I've been behind the times in contemporary music since I turned about 18. So my answers are going to be out of date usually. The questions about contemporary music.
I think Stevie Wonder is always up to date in my opinion, but I might be out of date as well. But I love the image too of him just surrounded by all these instruments. There's a kind of like in terms of virtuosity, but also curiosity in the ways that he performs. And I was thinking, I think I had mentioned Questlove, and also thinking about Esperanza Spalding too, as figures who are just where part of their iconicity is about their ability to kind of enter into these different genres and invent, and also make a kind of historical link to the music that they're making.
Roland Kirk would be another, Rahsaan Roland Kirk and Mingus, but they're long gone, both of them.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, should we open it up to Q&A? So we have a couple of questions for now. So there's time if you all are out there thinking about, do I want to ask a question? Do I not? There's still time. And then I have one I'm going to sneak in as well. The first person is Carl. Carl, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Yeah. You've touched on this a little bit, but I thought I'd ask it directly, and there's kind of 2 parts to it. One is, aside from obviously its kind of historic importance in the publishing history, what is it about St. Louis Blues as a song that makes it so much of a standard compared to all of the songs that might be clustered in the sort of same early blues classics things? Why does it stand out as the anthem? And relatedly, that, and maybe your answer will do both of these at once. Is there something? Is it a modernist gesture? And if so, in what way? What W.C. Handy did with the blues as it existed before him, and what he brought to it in codifying the form the ways that he did, and that kind of, was that a modernist move? So those two things together, I sort of two questions, but they're closely related, I think.
It's kind of unknowable, but my guess or my speculation, my theory is that the first two melodies are beautiful. Da 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 da. I probably shouldn't sing anymore for copyright purposes. The and then the second melody, the tango melody, da 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 da. It wasn't until Herbie Hancock made his Gershwin album, and at his insistence included the work of African American composers who had inspired and influenced Gershwin, which the record company agreed to. It wasn't until that album where Stevie Wonder sings St. Louis Blues accompanied by Herbie Hancock, it's an amazing performance, that I noticed that figure, da 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 da, that's the opening of Summertime by Gershwin. Da 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 da. So it's those are both great melodies. The first two melodies of St. Louis Blues. The third melodies, most singers depart from it. Da 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 da. It's fine. It works if you sing it. If the singer brings conviction to it. The narrative's strong. The lyrics are pretty classic, particularly the first stanza. I hate to see the evening sun go down. It's maybe the first published blues that sounds like a blues lyric. Earlier blues, published blues don't. Oh no, that's not true. There's one earlier published blues that sounds like a blues lyric, maybe even more so. But it's hideous. It's written by a blackface performer, a white performer who was in the Grand Ole Opry for decades. And I'm blanking on his name. Lassus was his stage name, short for molasses. And you might remember who he is, Carl. He had one published blues song published as the Negro Blues, but sung with the epithet. But the lyrics, other than the epithet, sound like classic blues lyrics. So the history is complicated, for sure. Handy's printed lyric uses the conventions of minstrelsy, D's and do's for these and those, stuff like that. But not even the blackface performers use that diction of the recordings I've heard. It was already on its way out as a performance style. To the second part of your question, is it a modernist gesture? Sure. I mean, I just go by James Weldon Johnson's assertion in 1922 in the introduction to the Book of American Negro Poetry. And I'm going to paraphrase, African American music is modern music, and it is American music. So ragtime, in Johnson's account in 1922, ragtime is modern music. Now and blues is modern music, according to Johnson. Johnson doesn't use the word jazz in 1922 in that essay anyway. And and from the sort of classic European modernist ideology, to quote Ezra Pound, make it new as being the ideology of modernism. African American musicians are always making it new. They're making it new more than anybody else. They're not doing it in the way that Europeans are claimed to be interested in, although they are, but they're doing it in the areas of rhythm and timbre. And so the European modernists are saying, oh, rhythm and timbre don't matter. That's just popular culture. Rhythm and timbre are popular culture. We don't care about rhythm and timbre unless we're making the changes in rhythm and timbre. But the popular changes in rhythm and timbre, that's just popular. That's just pandering. But that's just ideology that has no intellectual defensibility, as far as I can see. So yeah, combining a ragtime with a tango rhythm, why wouldn't it be a modernist gesture? My answers are so long, I'm sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you.
All right. So, Catherine Parrish, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks. Hi. This has been really interesting. I wanted to ask you about the Black Indian tradition in New Orleans. I kept thinking about it, and my knowledge of this is very limited. So if the things I see don't mesh, I'd like to know about that too. But yeah, I just, as you were talking, I kept thinking about it as you were talking about masking, as you were talking about performance, trickster characters, and and virtuosity, especially given the virtuosity in the making of the costumes and how they're bragging rights about that. So would you speak to that? And I don't know if you've seen any or thought about any direct influence that tradition might have had on Louis Armstrong, or whether they were just sort of parallel in that moment. Anyway, yeah, I'd love to hear you talk about that.
I know very little about it. I like the recordings I've heard of Black Indian Mardi Gras. They don't Mardi Gras Indian groups, and I forget the vocabulary they use to describe their groups. And no, I think that's a great line of inquiry, which I haven't thought about. I do know that Armstrong refused to go back to New Orleans for decades because of his dismay with how African American people were treated there. But he did return when he was elected to be the I think the title is King of the Zulus for Mardi Gras,
Right.
and I think he painted his face in blackface for the honor, and he deemed it a great honor to be chosen as King of the Zulus. And this would have been, I'm guessing, in the late 40s. I should know this, but I don't know it. No, it's a great question. The virtuosity of display in
Yes.
in that culture is fantastic and super interesting. And I've not done any reading about it except sort of in passing.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you. No, it's something more to think about.
Cheers.
And I do think that there are contested theories about what's happening with the performance of Black Indians, whether for some folks it's a claim to indigenous roots, which I think it might be, and also a performance in honor of Indian people. Like, I've also seen that theory. So I think it's a really interesting form, and I am not an expert on it, but I do think that it has a certain kind of contested status in terms of like ethnographies. But I do know that it's also a very serious and very kind of closed society in terms of performance. And so it's if we could talk about it as masking, I think it's a mask with a very intentional and respectful kind of history of it, as opposed to parody or play. So but
Absolutely.
yeah, but I definitely that's something I would love to know more about it as well, and maybe someone else out there knows more.
Oops, sorry, I was muted. I see a hand that's raised here. Veronica has a hand raised. Did you want to add to that? I don't know if that was an accident or.
Oh, yes. Can you hear me? No, no, no. It wasn't an accident. I'm not knowledgeable about the pieces in the instruction, but I'm interested, and I have this question for a while about because the jazz as a music, I see it as a transition and as a resistance too, and I that's why I was interested to hear and learn more from you guys. But I had these questions, and I don't know if there is an answer. Why I'm actually not from here, starting with, and I'm from Mexico, and from foreign perspective, and I also think from here in the United States, jazz is considered also like not, or is being sold as not popular music, which is not, and I understand it's not. And I think in some way has effect to reach more our communities. Why is that, and when that happened, and if that has been also a part to, that I understand black musicians early last century and mid, they've been using music for that purpose as a tool of resistance and empowering. And when or how that happened, that the music is being sort of pulled away from our communities and seen more as a popular music, as we see it when I visit New Orleans, for example, and you walk on the streets and you encounter about.
So I think we're getting a little bit of static. I don't know, John, were you able to understand the question? It's a little staticky. Veronica, would you mind maybe typing some of your question in to the chat? That might make it easier, just because we're just getting a little bit of static.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I heard some words, music and community, but I could not hear enough to be able to answer.
Okay, so what we can do is we have another question here. Ben Apatoff has a question. So maybe, Veronica, if you could just type your question, we can just get to it right after. Thank you. Ben, do you want to unmute and ask your question? Or I can read it. How about I read it? Playing off the question of today's modern day tricksters, I'm reminded of the time Louis Armstrong got uncharacteristically publicly angry about the, oh, he's trying to unmute. Okay. Not working. Okay, I'll just keep going. I'm gonna do it again. Playing off the question of today's modern day tricksters, I'm reminded of the time Louis Armstrong got uncharacteristically publicly angry about the Little Rock Nine. It's widely celebrated as a heroic move on his part these days. Has there been a comparable example of such a crowd pleaser suddenly taking such a blunt stance?
I don't know. Nothing is coming to mind. I'm happy for anybody to answer that question. For those who don't know, Armstrong was interviewed in a newspaper article and really blasted President Eisenhower for not standing up to Governor Faubus of Arkansas when Little Rock refused to desegregate the schools. And people were shocked by how bluntly he spoke. And he was going to go on a State Department tour, and he was uninvited to go on the State Department tour because of his bluntness toward the president.
It does also remind me of Eartha Kitt's outspoken critique of the Johnson administration and Lady Bird Johnson, and just a de-investment in the Black community that that she let loose at a White House ladies luncheon, and was then kind of taken off the rolls. But that's kind of during a similar period. But I don't know, I was thinking about Beyonce's speaking out about racism in country music as a maybe just to kind of think of my own obsessions. It's not as blunt and direct, but also other moments where she's also kind of talked about police brutality or talked about other moments of racism, but it's not off-brand in the way that Louis Armstrong's critique of power structure is. It's actually on brand. So I'm still kind of trying to think of a more parallel example.
Colin
Carl?
Kaepernick.
Um,
Colin Kaepernick kneeling.
yeah, yeah. I was going to step into and say, Francesca, we're each responding to this. I'm thinking of things from our own work, but I think there are lots of moments like that that are easy to forget. That because after somebody does something like that, then we revise our idea of them from their sort of apolitical time before. But we've been talking about New Orleans a bit and thinking of Katrina. Both Kanye West and Celine Dion in that period of time coming to the defense of the looters, and Kanye saying George Bush doesn't care about black people. That was not on brand for Kanye at the time. That he was not regarded as a political rapper in that sense. And Celine Dion defending the looters completely through the CNN host stuff when she started doing that, not realizing that she came from a French working class background and that could see political ties in New Orleans. And so, yeah, I think those little moments of interruption are they pop up all over pop culture, I think. But yeah, I think there's many more if we all put our mind to it that we would think of. And but with Louis Armstrong, it always felt like he was, hints would happen often, but they were hints. And it was just rare for him to be as blunt as that.
Sinead ripping up the photo of the Pope. I guess that's something.
Oh yeah. Sorry, my cat was knocking on the door, so I had to let the cat in. Yeah, Sinead, that's a great example. And yeah, you're right. Kanye. Now that's not on brand for Kanye anymore either. But at the time, it was vivid. It was huge.
So, John, I have a question for you. So about a month ago, Elijah Wald was here, and he has a book that has Jelly Roll Morton on the cover. It's about some of his uncensored songs, but also other people's and early blues, and it's important in American history. Jelly Roll Morton is kind of this figure that he uses to tell this larger story. And it sounds like St. Louis Blues is also used to tell a bigger story. So I'm just curious if you could tell us a little bit about process and how do you wrangle all that? How do you wrangle this larger story and filter it through this kind of smaller bit of cultural production? Like, how do you do this work?
As well as I can. Constructing a book is really super challenging and fun. This is my second try at it. I look at the chapters are organized more or less thematically. So the first chapter is introductory, and that's one of the ones I posted, which just lays out where I hope the book will go. And the early chapters are prehistory of the blues, ragtime and spirituals, or what Du Bois called this sorrow songs, and then Handy and Handy's place in sort of the early blues history. He was not the first person to publish a song with blues in the title. He was one of the first, and his songs were the first to be recorded. After that, I'm not trying to be comprehensive with the song because I don't think that's all that interesting. And and I don't think I'm capable of telling it interestingly in any case. So I'm just using instances of the song that bring up these rich cultural phenomena. And then so the early history of the blues and Black feminism and Angela Davis's argument of how the blues really brings to the forefront freedoms that were real freedoms that had not been enjoyed by people who had been enslaved. Freedom of movement, freedom of sexual freedom, and freedom of movement being the two ones. And so many blues songs are about those very two topics, and including St. Louis blues. And then the display of virtue early on, it becomes a site of displays of virtuosity with Smith, with Armstrong, with Fats Waller, Art Tatum, Cab Calloway, and I don't go into detail with very many of them, but I dig into a couple of them that pop out to me as bringing up interesting issues. Scat singing is another topic that St. Louis blues is rich with. So I more or less tell it chronologically up to 1956 when the performance was, and then the last chapter is sort of and then afterwards it kept on exploding all over the place. But at that point, the story, the conflicts have been played out, at least in terms of performances and recordings of the song. But then there's the sort of, in the last chapter is a sort of a couple of postscripts that sort of tie in things that have been going on throughout the book. For instance, there's it gassed me, man, it gassed me is just a key phrase. And then Armstrong's last hit was It's a Wonderful World. That was his last hit record in the 1960s. And on his next to last record, he re-recorded it in a really interesting album. And I'm blanking on the name of the album, Louis Armstrong and Friends, I think it's called. And it's sort of lush, somewhat funky arrangements written by Oliver Nelson, the great TV composer and the great jazz saxophonist and composer and arranger. And there's a Hollywood-esque component to some of the arrangements, but it's all sorts of he records The Creator Has a Master Plan by Pharoah Sanders and Leon Thomas. And Leon Thomas sings with him. And it's super interesting. He records Give Peace a Chance by John Lennon on that album. And he records We Shall Overcome with a cast of dozens, including Ornette Coleman singing backup in the recording session. It's just an amazing historical document. And musically, it's interesting, and I love it. It's not to everybody's taste. But he also re-records What a Wonderful World, and he precedes it with a spoken introduction. And it's a slowed down, lush arrangement, not lush in the same way as the original arrangement. It's got more elements of funk underlying in the rhythm. And he addresses the people addresses the criticism that the song had got. How can you say the world's so wonderful with war and pollution and poverty? Well, why don't you listen to old pops for a minute, he says. It seems to me it's not the world that's the problem, but what we're doing to it. And what we're doing here, how we're treating each other. I'm way off, I'm paraphrasing. But then he says, if we could just let the world be, then we wouldn't have war and poverty and pollution, and this world would be a gasser. And he uses the hipster jive that he had used to undermine Bernstein, but he uses it in a way that strikes me as super sincere and moving, that a gasser means the end of poverty and the end of war and the end of pollution. It means a complete transformation of society. it's really hopeful and beautiful. So I'm always looking for things that tie chronologically across time. And also in the last chapter, I also bring up Rapper's Delight and how that song ties to the past, not only with the mention of boogie, but also by using Good Times by Chic as the underlying rhythm track. And Good Times by Chic talks about jitterbugging in the lyric, which goes back to past African American virtuoso style. And then, of course, that song launches a future that's still unfolding stylistically. So yeah, I guess I'm always looking to weave things as much as possible to make it fun to read and interesting to think about.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank
We-
you.
One final question. So I got Veronica's question. So let's see. She says here, I've been wondering how or why jazz music has been not seen or sold as a popular music, as for example happens in New Orleans, when in other places, it's moved away from communities sort of for an intellectual audience. So she's wondering what could be the forces behind, these different ways that jazz is read.
Oh, that's a good. I think about that all the time, actually. That's great. I love that question. In most jazz histories say that jazz veered off from popular music after the Second World War and during the Second World War to an extent with the advent of bebop, where bebop became a more harmonically, and in some ways melodically, in some ways rhythmically complex style or convention, idiom. What's super interesting is that if in the 1930s swing is the dominant style and it is popular music, also happening at the same time as bebop is what we now call jump blues, Louis Jordan, and many other, which becomes rhythm and blues. But from a certain perspective, rhythm and blues, to me anyway, rhythm and blues and jump blues is jazz. Improvised solos, a lot of the same players, a lot of the big band players. Panama Francis, the drummer with Lucky Malinder, was playing with Sister Rosetta Tharpe in the 30s, in the 30s, and then again in the 50s, and it was gospel, but it was a very R&B influenced gospel in the 50s that Sister Rosetta Tharpe was recording. So I think there's an interest in the music on the part of the musicians after the Second World War. A lot of the musicians just we're just gonna do what we want to do. We're gonna do it in such a way that if you don't keep up with us harmonically, you won't be able to play with us. And I think there was a very conscious modernist edge, and it was even called modern jazz at the time, to what Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Thelonious Monk and their cohort, Bud Powell, all the others were doing. And after that, jazz became, to a degree, less popular. But still, the influence of bebop is, you hear it in movie soundtracks and TV soundtracks throughout the 1960s and 70s. So it never completely stopped being popular. And in fact, Charlie Parker wrote an R&B hit. He wrote The Hucklebuck. That's based on a tune he wrote called Now's the Time, which is just a super interesting tidbit. Charlie Parker wrote an R&B hit. Yeah, he wrote an R&B hit. He wrote The Hucklebuck. He didn't get credit for it. I don't remember who claimed the copyright on it, but it was the same tune as Now's the Time.
I wonder too, like thinking, this is much more recently, but thinking about someone like Wynton Marsalis, who is wanting to recuperate jazz as America's classical music, that there's another kind of movement to keep jazz in some ways as like kind of like giving birth to the popular, but not necessarily popular or commercial music, but instead something to elevate it. And so I just wonder, I don't know, but I just wonder too if some of those movements to elevate jazz and kind of think about its influence, its wide influence has also kind of segregated it or separated it from other forms of music that it actually isn't really true in terms of how jazz has influenced all these other styles. That's just a hunch, though.
Yeah, and it goes back to the Duke Ellington writing in extended forms as early as the late 1920s, trying to write in forms longer than just the pop song 32 bar standard. Well, pop songs weren't always 32 bars, but that's the most common form of the pop song from 1915 to 1955 or something. Very rough dates there. Yeah, no, I think, and Fat Swaller loved classical music, and he wanted to compose, and he played Bach on his own, and he played classical organ for his own pleasure. James P. Johnson mostly retired from performing and recording jazz to compose classical music, and he had some success, and he faced a lot of barriers, and his symphonic version of St. Louis Blues was mostly lost, which is really indicative of the oppression of white dominance. James P. Johnson's one of the great musicians of the 20th century, period. He was hugely influential on all of jazz piano that followed him, directly influenced Ellington and Waller and Thelonious Monk, and through them indirectly influenced everybody. He played on a bunch of Bessie Smith records in the 20s, wrote hits for Bessie Smith that were later covered by Eric Clapton, one of them, I think. No, I'm thinking of a different song. So he wrote the Charleston, the anthem of the 1920s, one of the most prominent musicians of the 20th century, and there's been one book written about him. That's crazy. But that bespeaks the racism of our institutions. There should be as many books about James P. Johnson as there are about Gershwin or Berlin, right? I mean, it just stands to reason. He had as wide a range. And he wrote a symphonic arrangement, 4 movements of St. Louis Blues. 3 of the movements are gone. That's tragic. And that's part of the history behind Armstrong playing with Bernstein, at least to my mind. And Johnson was a friend of Armstrong's.
Okay, well, that was a great conversation. Thank you so much, Sean and Francesca.
Thank you.
Yeah, so please join us next week when Robert Dayton will be here in conversation with Carl Wilson to talk about his book, Cold Glitter, The Untold Story of Canadian Glam.